barbecue didn't start in Texas. It didn't start in Kansas City or the Carolinas or Memphis. Its real origins reach back across 3 continents, through indigenous civilizations, the transatlantic slave trade, and some of the darkest and most overlooked chapters in American history. And here's what makes this even more striking. Most of the pitmasters cooking barbecue today have never heard the full story. Welcome to the Meatz. Today, we're going back to the very beginning, not just the backyard or the smokehouse, but the true, complicated, extraordinary birth of the cooking tradition that defines American food culture. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a rack of ribs or a brisket the same way again. Let's start where the word itself comes from, because even that is more surprising than most people expect. The word barbecue traces back to the Taíno people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean. When Spanish explorers arrived in the late 1400s, they encountered a wooden framework the Taíno used to slow cook and smoke meat over an open fire. They called it a barabicu. Roughly translated, it means sacred fire pit or the place of the holy fire. The Spanish borrowed the word. It evolved into barbacoa and eventually crossed into English as barbecue. So the very name of this tradition comes from a people whose civilization was largely destroyed within a century of that first contact. That's a weight worth sitting with. But the Taíno weren't alone in developing slow-fire cooking. Long before Europeans arrived in the Americas, indigenous nations across North and South America were pit-roasting meat, smoking fish, and cooking over controlled fires in ways that were sophisticated, culturally meaningful, and deeply tied to the land. The idea that barbecue is an American invention is technically true, but the Americans who invented it weren't European settlers. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most barbecue documentaries skip entirely, and it's the part that matters most if you want to understand why American barbecue looks and tastes the way it does today. When European colonists established plantations across the American South in the 17th and 18th centuries, they brought enslaved Africans with them, people forcibly taken from cultures with their own rich, ancient traditions of cooking over fire. West and Central African culinary traditions included whole animal cooking, slow braising, and the use of bold spice blends and rubs that were extraordinarily sophisticated. These weren't people with no food knowledge. They were master cooks stripped of everything except their skill and their memory. On southern plantations, enslaved people were typically given the least desirable cuts of meat, the parts that required the most skill and the longest cooking times to make palatable. Pork ribs, shoulder, hocks, pig ears, beef brisket. These were the scraps.
And what enslaved cooks did with those scraps is nothing short of culinary genius. They applied their African knowledge of slow fire, bold seasoning, and patient technique to these tough, cheap cuts, and they transformed them into something transcendent. Low heat, long time, smoke, and intuition. That is the foundation of American barbecue, and it was built almost entirely by enslaved black hands. This is the part of the story that tends to get scrubbed clean in the popular mythology of barbecue. You'll hear about legendary pitmasters of the 20th century, about regional styles, about secret sauces passed down through generations. What you'll hear less about is that the entire framework, the technique, the patience, the philosophy of turning the worst cuts into the best food comes directly from the forced labor and genius of enslaved African Americans. Here's your pitmaster secret for today, and it's more history than technique, but it's essential. The cuts we celebrate most in barbecue, brisket, pork shoulder, spare ribs, these were not choice cuts. They were survival food, elevated by necessity and mastery. When you're cooking a brisket low and slow for 12 hours, you're participating in a tradition born from that exact combination, the toughest cut, the most patient cook, and the knowledge that fire and time can transform anything. Honor that the next time you fire up the smoker. So we've covered the Taíno origins of the word itself, the indigenous fire cooking traditions that predate European contact, and the African culinary genius that shaped the actual technique. Now here's where the story escalates, because the spread of American barbecue across regions isn't just about geography. It's about migration, freedom, and economic survival. After the Civil War, many newly freed Black Americans became professional pitmasters, one of the few economic paths available to them in the post-Reconstruction South. They opened barbecue stands, catering businesses, and small restaurants. They built the regional styles we recognize today, the vinegar and pepper traditions of the Carolinas, the thick, sweet tomato sauces of Kansas City, the dry rubs of Memphis. These weren't invented by anonymous forces of regional preference. They were crafted by specific people in specific communities under specific economic and social pressures.
And then the Great Migration happened. Between 1910 and 1970, millions of Black Americans moved north and west, fleeing Jim Crow laws and seeking opportunity. They brought their barbecue with them. Chicago's South Side became a barbecue hub, so did Detroit, Los Angeles, and Oakland. The food that had been born in slavery and refined through Reconstruction traveled across the country and became, ironically, one of the most beloved and widely shared culinary traditions in the world. Texas brisket, arguably the most globally recognized style today, has its own fascinating thread in this story.
German and Czech immigrants settling Central Texas in the mid-1800s brought their traditions of smoked meats and meat markets. But the technique of long, slow smoking over post oak, that was absorbed from and refined alongside the African-American pitmasters already working in Texas. The styles cross-pollinated, and what emerged is the cathedral of smoke and bark we now call Texas-style barbecue. Here's what ties all of this together, and this is the most important thing you can take away from this video. Every major American barbecue tradition, regardless of region, regardless of meat, is a story about transformation. Taking what's tough and making it tender. Taking what's rough and making it beautiful. That philosophy didn't come from abundance. It came from necessity, from brilliance, from cultures that knew fire in ways European settlers didn't, and from cooks who were never given credit for what they built. The smoke, the bark, the pull of properly cooked pork shoulder, the trembling jiggle of a perfect brisket, that's not just great food, that's centuries of human ingenuity and survival cooked slow and served hot. So the next time someone argues about whose barbecue is the best, Carolina or Texas, wet or dry, pork or beef, just smile, because the real answer is that it all comes from the same fire, a fire lit by people who deserved far more recognition than history gave them. If this changed how you think about barbecue, drop a comment below. I want to know, what's your regional style, and did you know any of this history before today? Hit like if you learned something, and subscribe to the Meatz post, because we are just getting started. Next time, we're getting into the actual technique, how to smoke a brisket low and slow the way the original pitmasters did it, with a full breakdown of rubs, wood selection, and the one mistake that ruins every brisket. You don't want to miss that one.